My name is Dustin Kelly, but everybody calls me DJ. I'm prior Army, serving as both a Ford observer and a military police officer. I've spent the last 14 and a half years as a police officer and detective in a large metropolitan police department. Two things that I've learned throughout my career. One, everybody has a story to tell. And two, the best stories are true. This is the DTD Podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to the DTD Podcast. This week in the studio, Samuel Katz. He's a New York-based New York Times best-selling author, magazine editor, and special feature correspondent. He's written over 30 books and articles for publication around the world, including editions of Vanity Fair, Esquire, and GQ. He was the founder and editor-in-chief of Special Operations Report, a quarterly magazine dedicated to military and law enforcement special operations and counterterrorism. He's appeared on numerous international television and radio networks and also lectures law enforcement agencies and military commands around the world. Katz is also an international business development, marketing, and media consultant for industries around the world. With the recent passing of September 11th, tonight we're going to talk about another terrorist attack that almost was, Jihad in Brooklyn. Welcome. How are you, Sam?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got a hold of you because I wanted to talk about this story because I think it's a very lesser known attack that was going to happen on New York. I think that a lot of people, when they think about the terrorist attacks, of course 9/11 comes to their mind. Of course, some of the bombings that happened in New York City, the USS Cole, but this one is not really at the forefront of people's mind. And it's so interesting how not only it almost happened, but all the characters, how they came together, and ultimately who came to the aid of the United States government and the United States themselves. It was a very interesting person. So if we can we get a little backstory on Jihad in Brooklyn?
Sure. Well, the attack that was planned was going to be the first suicide bombing ever perpetrated in the United States. And it was foiled by law enforcement and by a very strange set of circumstances. But I think it's important to kind of set the stage for what New York City was like at the time, in terms of law enforcement and the war on terror, or the terror war against the United States. New York was and forever is the epicenter of the world in terms of people from all over the planet coming here. You have every culture and ethnic group known to man that is in the city. And during the war in Afghanistan, the city was used by elements of this government to recruit individuals from the Middle East who wanted to travel to Afghanistan and fight the good fight against the Soviet Union. And individuals that were recruited for that struggle carried very jihadist views, motivated by the call to arms in Afghanistan. And slowly New York City began to be host to terrorist incidents, terror plots. There was the 1990 assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane by an Egyptian El Sayed Nasser. Individuals that protested Nasser's innocence at the trial were later part of the cell that was responsible for the bombing of the World Trade Center. That cell and the blind Egyptian sheikh that rallied the locals was behind a plot to blow up the United Nations and government buildings in New York. So New York City was already well on its way to becoming a quote-unquote ground zero in the war on terror. And law enforcement, the New York City Police Department in particular, was aware of this and developed certain skills and understanding that they were a target. You also need to know that New York, besides being the epicenter of the world, also hosts every September the United Nations General Assembly, as it's doing now. World leaders from every country on the planet come here. And the local law enforcement, in working with the feds, were well in tune in the early 1990s. At the same time that all these events are happening, New York City is cleaned up. Rudy Giuliani came in as a law enforcement mayor, and Rudy Giuliani helped bring crime down and helps launch a renaissance of the city. But because whatever happens around the world also happens in New York City, there was an intifada going on in Israel, an uprising. And an uprising, in this case, that was characterized by suicide bombings, the bombings of buses and cafes, and individuals who would seek to perpetrate catastrophic damage on innocent civilians. And the lines were drawn in New York City. If you were a supporter of Israel, these were crimes that were absolutely abhorrent. And if you were pro the other side, they were freedom fighters. And in this underground of immigrants, communities that existed in New York, it attracted individuals from the West Bank and Gaza and from Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere, where people wanted a better life, people wanted to make a fast buck, and people wanted just to escape the violence. And there were, I wouldn't say an illegal underground of illegal workers that existed in New York. But if you didn't have papers in New York, you could easily find a place to live, people who would support you. And there were no shortage of flop houses and illegal structures that landlords would put up where they could charge individuals that didn't have their proper legal status as much as they could for a room or an apartment by the day or the week or the month. And into this equation comes two Palestinians from the West Bank. They had both had run-ins with the Israeli security services. But then again, virtually everybody would have had run-ins with the Israeli security services because of the Intifada and the campaign of suicide bombings that followed the return of Yasser Arafat to Gaza and the West Bank as part of the Oslo Accords. And New York City found itself in a very uncomfortable situation of one evening forced to encounter the threat of what would have been the first suicide bombing in New York City, and what would have undoubtedly been a catastrophic attack resulting in hundreds of dead. And that was a twin suicide bombing of a subway train as it traveled from Brooklyn into Manhattan.
Now, I'd like to point out that this also was going to be a special kind of suicide bombing. They were going to enact a new way in where a bomb went off. They got whoever they were going to get in that epicenter of it. Then, when the first responders came in to take care of the victims or get chaos controlled into it, a second bomb would go off. And
yes. The tactic the Israelis called double tap was first used in January of 1995. There was a cafe, a roadside stand where motorists and soldiers could buy snacks and cigarettes and just a quick thing on the highway. And two Palestinian bombers from the Islamic Jihad were well positioned. They were dressed as Israeli soldiers, and they carried kit bags with explosives. The first bomber with his device set himself off among all the victims. And then once the first responders came, the second bomber set himself off. And it's one of the reasons why in Israel paramedics wore body armor and were armed. And it's also why in suicide bombings, the bomb squad in Israel, the EOD people, had tactical command. And the Israelis developed tactics in dealing with double taps and the whole tradecraft of suicide bombings. But again, we're talking about pre-9/11, when law enforcement in this country, let alone around the world, didn't talk.
Yeah,
They,
right. And here's the interesting part to it, and I guess this is kind of the $1 million question. I think a lot of people want to understand with all of this going on in the West Bank and everything that's going on, suicide bombings, the attacks. You see that happen, but then you see them leave from there, come to the United States, become radicalized either there or over here, and want to bring harm to the United States. And I think a lot of people have a tough time wrapping their brain around understanding it's happening over there. You're angry about who's being put into power. There's all kinds of power struggles going on over there, but you come over here to inflict harm. And I think a lot of people don't understand why that happens. If you could explain some of the psychology behind that.
oh, well, if I could explain the psychology behind that, I'd be sitting in the halls of power in Washington. There were two Palestinian men, one Ghazi Abu Mazer, who came to the United States via Canada, through the Pacific Northwest. He was stopped in Washington State. He was apprehended. He failed to show for his desk ticket to plead his case, and he made his way to New York. And the second, Lafi Khalil, um, had a transit visa, and the agent at customs mistook it for an entry visa, and he was allowed to enter the United States. They came to New York, both of them, and they ended up in a neighborhood which, at the time in Brooklyn, which there are many Middle Eastern communities in Brooklyn, and they ended up in a part of Brooklyn in Park Slope that at the time was run down and as yet to be gentrified, which of course today it's one of the more exclusive parts of Brooklyn, but that just goes to show that this was 1997,
Right.
And New York City has changed incredibly.
Same with the Bronx, right? Where they went through and they revitalized, where they sold blocks of the Bronx for, of Harlem for like $1. And
Yeah, they were selling brownstones in 1995 in Harlem, dilapidated brownstones
right.
for $10,000. It's yours to pay and take, and today they're worth $3-4 million. And I know a lot of police officers who worked in Harlem at the time who are kicking themselves in the head that they didn't make that investment. But the city wasn't great at the time. It was who knew that it would become.
Right. Absolutely.
Um, so, going back to your question about the psychology of both men, there's no evidence that there was a insidious plot.
Okay.
There's no evidence that they were members of any organization, hardcore members. But of course, you didn't have to be. If Ghazi Abu Mazer spent time in an Israeli jail or in military detention, there were all sorts of reasons why individuals would be. I'm sure that the situation there wasn't pleasant. It might have hardened him. He was obviously, of the two, he was the leader. And it's never known, it's still not known, if they were part of some horrific plot, the first seeds of Hamas trying to bring suicide bombings to the United States, or if they were using their homegrown knowledge, what they learned on the streets. And again, the knowledge of building explosives was common among the young men in the West Bank who were fighting Israel and lining up to join one group or another to martyr themselves. This was not splitting the atom. The explosive knowledge in terms of building homemade explosives was fairly well known, and they worked at odd jobs here. They looked at adult magazines in the local newsstand back when we still had newsstands, and they were looking for women. They weren't the hardcore jihadists. They weren't devout in the sense of the 9/11 hijackers,
Okay.
for example. And they traveled to North Carolina, for example, doing odd jobs at someone's grocery store, and they became somewhat infatuated with firearms and the ready availability of firearms. And they lived in a flop house behind 4th and President Street that from the street was invisible. I mean, unless they broke the law, unless someone could identify them as being illegal, they could have lived here for years and have never come to anyone's attention.
So
And
that would be my first question, just to kind of get in here for it. With Mazer, he was caught 3 times at the border. Now I believe that these two couldn't have met up in New York in stranger circumstances or by any more different means than they did. You talked about him going to Canada. He had come down, tried to get through. He was apprehended 3 times by Immigration and Naturalization Services at different points for different reasons. He gave different reasons why he was moving through there. Now, there wasn't, as you said, there wasn't any known right now insidious plots with them. He had gotten in trouble, though, with the law for credit card fraud. He had an assault. He had been in trouble in the West Bank. And so he has a purpose, though, that you put throughout the book, that he is bound and determined to get into the United States no matter what it takes. And then when you go to Khalil, you see that him coming here, he kind of just slid in under the radar. And they have different purposes, but they both seem to have the same end game. Would that be a fair assumption of the book?
um, Ghazi Abu Mazer was the bad seed among the two. And he was more of the individual who you could see would rally someone to do something stupid. Um, Lafi Khalil was the lesser intelligent, if that could be assessed, of the two of them. And it's it's very common for people who are living illegally to seek out their own, and you go to a local restaurant or grocery store and people put you know paper on the wall, needed a handyman, needed contractor, needed dishwasher, and um, an entire underground universe existed. And again, before 9/11 and Patriot Act and all sorts of things, it was incredibly easy for individuals to just disappear here, especially in New York. If you didn't jump the turnstile, if you didn't litter, jaywalk, or do something that under Giuliani, the cops were very proactive, if you didn't graffiti or urinate on the subway, you could really go under the radar. And they they were successful at it, but they had somewhere, somehow, they convinced themselves that they were going to matter. And I think that that's something that is important here, because the people in the West Bank at the time who were rock stars, who were celebrities, were the martyrs, the suicide bombers, the people who the Israelis had killed or had killed themselves or who were in prison. If you went into a refugee camp, or if you went into the main streets in Nablus or Jenin or Tulkarm, wherever, the photos of these people were all over. They were on billboards. They were worshipped as heroes of the cause, and that was part of the psychological game, how the terrorist entities recruited new members. Someone from the Israeli Secret Service once told me how difficult it was to interrogate these individuals from Hamas and the Islamic Jihad as opposed to the other groups. And they had already come to the conclusion that they had one step in paradise and one step in prison. one foot in prison, one foot in paradise. So really, what was the interrogator ever going to do? And it hardened them. It hardened their resolve, and it made them very determined. So I don't think that at the time in this country, certainly at the local level, that mentality was understood. And I still believe, after 20 years of a global war on terror, we're talking about the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we still don't understand that mindset. And we still don't understand the hearts and minds, and that the religious aspect is often second to other elements that we fail to look into or understand.
Well, when these two first started, you write in the book that they really weren't that religious in the beginning.
Yeah.
They had gone to a mosque. They went and prayed on Fridays mostly, but they got into it a little more. Now, this mosque, though, in particular, becomes a problem over and over. The Alpharook Mosque.
The Alpharook Mosque was used as a transit point um, for people going to become the Afghan Arabs. It was used by the CIA and others to help facilitate transit during the war in Afghanistan, the first war. No, it's not the first war. They've been fighting since the 1800s
Right.
against empires that were foreign. It was used to recruit individuals who wanted to go on their summer vacation and kill Soviets. And individuals that were part of the separate plot, the World Trade Center and Rabbi Kahane and the Day of Terror, were all part of that network. They would take leave from their jobs as limo drivers and other things, and they would go and they'd come back after they surviving some combat. They would learn skills and they would return. They couldn't really go back to visit their own countries because in many ways they were persona non grata in their own countries. Um, One of the things how all this ultimately evolved, 9/11 and Al Qaeda, was that when the war in Afghanistan began and it became a rallying point, many Arab countries emptied their prisons of Islamic extremists and they shipped them off to Afghanistan. And that became a very potent force that became transnational.
So how does something like that happen, though? You say that these countries empty out their prisons and they move them. Is it just they just take them to the border and tell them get out, or I mean, how does that happen without? And I understand the government is fractured and everything, but how does something like that with mass exoduses of people into the country? How does that
They're
even
not
happen?
they're not really mass exoduses. They're more of you're sentenced here for life. Will set you free. I mean, Ayman Zawahiri, the current leader of Al Qaeda, was in an Egyptian prison until he was released. He was in an Egyptian prison for being part of the Muslim Brotherhood plot that assassinated President Sadat in 1981.
And so, if you were to take, because you say it's not mass, so if you were to take a guess, what are we talking about? Like, how many people are we saying when this starts
Thousands
happening?
ultimately went.
Thousands.
Thousands.
Okay.
People that to get to Afghanistan back then required a one-way ticket to Pakistan. And the Pakistanis were more than happy to facilitate their arrival because the Pakistani intelligence service was using the Afghan Arabs to have a say in the future of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, again going back to history, is a vital buffer between outside powers and India and Pakistan, and it remains. I mean, the Pakistanis, our allies, remain the most potent supporters of the Taliban today. So it was a perfect storm, the 20 years before 9/11 and the 20 years since. And these two young Palestinians um, Again, the motivation is still a mystery, but one of the things why some individuals blow themselves up is for relevance. It's for the promise of paradise. It's for the promise of making a difference. It's for the purpose of mattering. And if you were a Palestinian living illegally in New York, going from odd job to odd job, um, the sense of doing something stupid and heinous that will secure your relevance later on in life um, is in their eyes worth dying for.
Well, you mentioned in there that in the book where you talk about when they were working these odd jobs that they would talk to the bosses at these jobs a lot about how poor they were, about how much they didn't have. But you pointed out and I've said it before, you pointed out a clear distinction between the two. Khalil was only interested in finding a woman, and Mazer was only wanted money. And you saw that a lot when you talk about Khalil and going down to, at that time, Times Square, spending a lot of his work money on strip clubs and going out to bars. And then Mazer not really doing that. But they all seem to come back to that mosque. Now, another problem with that mosque was Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was asked to leave in 1991 after he had anti-American rhetoric. So we see that that's already starting to build up there. So I guess I'm not understanding with the CIA using it, with there being that clear distinction between the two, almost that dichotomy between the two. How do those two worlds collide together?
Well, you have to go to the timeline. I apologize for the thunder
Well, I don't
um,
think you can
in,
slow that down. So,
in the background. In the 80s, the Alpharook Mosque was the CIA transit point. And then when the Soviets left, there was no need to send these people overseas. So the Alpharook Mosque um, stopped being a transit point, but it was still a very popular radical location. The preachers were there. Individ- I think the underground universe that exists needs to be understood. Um, the emigre, the illegal, the first generations, even the people who are established here, they raise money for the old country, wherever that old country would be. And radicals raised money here. Radicals came and gave lecture tours. They spoke. They came with hat in hand and they gave sermons in mosques. Um, this country also had all sorts of freedoms that existed where you could say whatever the hell you wanted to say. So the Al Farouk Mosque stopped being functional in terms of this country's interests. It remained a radical hub. But by 1995, the Sheikh and all the others are already guests of the government. So the focus kind of withered away, but the preaching didn't. And the preaching at the mosque at the time would have focused a lot on what went on in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Again, look at the time period. In 1993, Oslo comes, Arafat comes back, there's talk of peace. Hamas uses that peace and the creation, and there was a terrorist attack by a Jewish extremist in 1994 that gave Hamas its spark to launch suicide bombings. The suicide bombings helped bring about political turmoil in Israel that ultimately resulted in Israeli Prime Minister Rabin being assassinated. After the assassination, the Israelis killed the master Hamas bomb builder. There were reprisal suicide bombings, buses, cafes, children's birthday parties. So in the mosque, where the one Palestinian who was interested in women and the other who was interested in money would come with their aspirations unfulfilled, and they would hear the sermons, and they would be with individuals like themselves, and individuals who might have been better off, might have been more successful, might have grabbed a piece of the American dream. And I think personally that their motive was wanting to be relevant. And the interesting chain of events that happened that night in July of 1997 might not have happened had there not been the day before a horrific suicide bombing in Jerusalem that left close to 20 dead and scores more wounded in the market, when two Palestinian bombers, dressed as attorneys, perpetrated a double tap suicide bombing. And that was an event that was in the news. Again, it's before that the 24/7 news cycle dominates everything, and before social media where everybody would look at it on their phone. But individuals who were on the job were aware of it, because the attack that happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Israel would have been at 7 in the morning local time. And it would be in the news, even if it's just a brief snippet. So when the two Palestinians who were building a bomb in this illegal structure were talking about Jerusalem, and that they would mimic that that event. Another piece of the puzzle, an Egyptian that was living there, who came to catch the American dream in all its splendor and glory, got really nervous, because where he comes from in Egypt, if you were part of a conspiracy, if you are part of a plot, even if there's a slight insinuation that you might have been living on the same street.
That's what I was going to say, that even if they think that you're part of it.
The Secret Service in Egypt, the Mukhabarat, not only takes you for questioning, and again, the questioning would need to be in italics, but they take your wife and your kids. And when I was in Egypt before 9/11, an Egyptian security said, what's the difference between being in prison in Egypt in the year 1300 and in 2000? And the answer was, now you get a plastic bucket to shit in.
I guess that's being honest.
Being very honest. So this individual, this Egyptian, wanted to bring his family over. He wanted to do everything that was right. The problem was that he knew nothing about how to report a crime. He spoke almost no English. And when they were in their room in this building, this walk-up in an illegal structure in Brooklyn, working on their bombs, and they said, "Did you see what happened in Jerusalem today? We're going to do that today on the subway." He freaked, and a perfect storm followed. But it was a perfect storm not in destruction, but in all the things that could have gone wrong went right. The Egyptian flagged down two police officers from the Long Island Railroad Police, who there was a commuter rail stop in a hub in Brooklyn, Atlantic. It's part near the Barclays Center. It's now in the epicenter of gentrified Brooklyn, but at the time it was a sleepy train station, and these two officers were patrolling, and this Egyptian was yelling, "Boom, boom." He was all agitated and nervous, and they could very well have treated him like he was emotionally disturbed. They could have easily dismissed him as a nutcase, or they could have told him just to go disappear. How many times have cops not wanted to be bothered? But they saw merit in his panic, and they took him to the precinct, the NYPD precinct, and they they brought him to the detective squad, and the detectives saw that they were incredibly nervous and agitated, that he was the Egyptian, and they summoned an Arabic-speaking individual. And that Arabic-speaking police officer then said that there's a bomb plot going on. So you have what happened in Jerusalem in the morning. You have this individual, and there was merit in his panic and his fear, and there was dread that what happens if he's right and we ignore him. So the wheels of the NYPD went into full gear. Again, this is very late at night, so this is the midnight tour, when the emergency service unit, which is the NYPD's rescue and tactical unit, has a much smaller footprint than it would during the morning or the evening tours. Um, there was a the chief on call at the time happened to be a former Marine, a military man, came from the housing police before they merged, and he called his counterpart in special operations, and together they arrived at the precinct, and they made sure that the informant drew out a sketch and mapped everything out, and they had to do they had to figure out what's going on here. There are no acceptable losses in law enforcement, one of the officers in the raid said. We don't go up against suicide bombers. It's not part of our job description.
Well,
How
and you
big
got to
was
think at this time too, like you said, this is new to law enforcement too. I mean, that is strictly a military tactic, and even at that time, we're not even in the war on terror yet. So that's not even really a military thing yet.
It's not a military thing, and there's also, and again, as a police officer would think, what happens if the informant is wrong? What happens if he is a psycho? What happens if they kick down the door and there's a shooting? And what happens if the individuals are innocent? What happens if you catch them in the middle of having dinner, having breakfast? But there was also concern, what if the bomb was real? How big was it? Was it big enough to topple the building? If the building collapsed, would it go down into and sever the gas lines? Would it cause an enormous fire? Would it collapse into the subway tunnel that was underneath the house? So slowly and without setting off any alarms, Con Ed, the utilities, had to be informed. The subway had to be shut down. And these things are not easy to do on a perfect day. Imagine doing it at midnight, where the tug of war and the shouting match that exists between supervisors who really want to just sleep on the couch that night and hope that it's quiet and nobody's going to bother them. All of a sudden are facing an enormous citywide emergency, something absolutely catastrophic. Again, this is 4 years after the World Trade Center was bombed, so it's not something that's new to the vernacular. There's the detectives in unmarked cars drive by the location, and they don't see the diagram, they don't see the building, because it's behind the building.
Right.
So there's all sorts of worries. The officers are themselves, the assault team, the tactical team, the supervisor, and the captain, the XO of the emergency service unit, are all worried about their careers, their pensions. They're worried that this could be a disaster, this could be career-ending, let alone life-ending, and they really have concerns that police in this country never had to deal with before. They enter the location around 4 o'clock in the morning, and they kick. They go into the vestibule of the building and they don't see anything. They begin to get angry, and then they're led behind the building to the main structure. They're given the key from the informant. They enter it and they confront the two Palestinians in their bedroom. And the Palestinians resist. And each is shot 3 times. The injuries aren't life-threatening, and the perpetrators are taken into custody and then taken into the hospital for treatment. But you have to raid all the other apartments because you don't know how far-reaching this plot is. So the tactical team had to go in and raid every location. And one of the officers that was involved remembers looking up from his vantage point. He was out with the shotgun in front of the building, and all the window shades would open after they heard the tumult, and individuals in Middle Eastern garb would look out the window, and you heard Middle Eastern music, and you heard Middle East Arabic being spoken, and you smelled the smells of Middle Eastern cooking. It was like being in another country, but you were in the center of Brooklyn. Once they're in custody, you have to disarm the devices. The federal authorities come involved. There's a joint terrorism task force that was formed after the World Trade Center bombing. The agent that was on call that night was from the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. He had some worldly knowledge, and he interviewed the suspects from their hospital beds. The FBI came to look at the devices. Now, when the ESU officers raided the location, Ghazi Abu Mazer flipped the toggle switch on the device. He was ready to blow himself up. And Ghazi Abu Mazer wasn't a large individual, and the members of the assault team that went into the room were. And even after being shot, he wanted to blow himself up. He still wanted to matter. But the device didn't go off. And what's interesting is that the FBI recreated the devices, and every time they flipped the toggle switch in simulation, it went off. So it was a perfect storm that everything that could have gone wrong went right that night for law enforcement.
So let me ask you something about that, because when they do that raid, and when we're done with this, I'd like to go back and talk about that informant for a minute. But when they do the raid, and he decides, because he tells them in his interview that he did want to blow himself up, he mentioned that there were 4 switches, and when all 4 switches were flipped, that's when it would go off. He explained where the gunpowder came from. He said everything. So if he's leading this, and they are pretty aware that he's going to be the leader of this group, what are they asking Khalil about?
The same thing. Why? What's your network support? There had not been in New York City, or nothing that has been revealed to date, known Hamas cells, direct action cells. There had been members of Palestinian terrorist groups in the U.S. before. There's an infamous case of someone from the Abu Nidal organization in St. Louis who the FBI bugged his house, and he was caught on tape murdering his daughter because she wanted to be an American and not Palestinian. And that ultimately led to his arrest. But there was no known Hamas cell, Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad cell operating in the U.S. at the time. But let me just backtrack a second, because what would have been of concern to the FBI was the fact that in 1997, there had already been an established, very strong nexus between Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, and elements in the United States. There were charities, ultimately closed after 9/11, that raised money for Hamas, that were used to buy explosives and weapons and support the families of individuals in prison. There was an individual in Florida who raised money for the Islamic Jihad, and he was very well known in political circles. And there was a professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Dr. Shala, who, after the head of the Islamic Jihad was assassinated, allegedly, by the Mossad in 1995, simply walked out on his job in Florida, went to Damascus, and became the head of the Islamic Jihad terrorist group. So the connection, and if you want to connect the dots in hindsight, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing specific that linked these two to any dangerous, nefarious cell that was funded, operational, and poised to strike.
But Metzer, he agreed that he was Hamas, correct? During his interview.
He did, but again, it's like saying I like the Philadelphia Eagles.
Okay.
To survive, and to survive in prison or in detention in the West Bank, regardless if you were in Israeli custody or Palestinian Authority custody, it pays to be part of an organization.
Okay.
They protect their own. And if you're a free spirit or a freelancer, your time behind bars might be less than pleasant.
So I guess then with all of these unanswered questions, with not being really a match point for, you know, striking and getting these guys radicalized, or what turned them over, or what their ultimate goal was, other than what you said about being relevant, it doesn't seem like the normal story you hear. There's always an end purpose, and I get what you're saying about being known, and the rock stars were the people that were the suicide bombers and things like that. But these guys seem to not really have a purpose. In everything I read in the book, there wasn't anything that really said, like, these guys are hardcore extremists, other than the terrorist attack that was going to happen. But then they gave no reason behind it.
What reason do you need to blow yourself up? What reason do you need to try and find a meaning to your life in death?
And I get what you're saying there, but they weren't just going to kill themselves. They were going to make an incident where they took out, he specifically said he picked that train at that time because it was loaded with Jews.
Yes. And because if you kill yourself, if you jump off the 59th Street Bridge, you haven't done anything to make yourself relevant. But they think in terms of, which is one of the reasons why they all have the photos taken, holding the Quran and their assault rifle behind the backdrop. It's why they do their living wills on videotape. You want the message to resonate after you're dead. You want that message. Well, they don't want. Their recruiters want. The masterminds want. The masterminds don't blow themselves up, of course. You find stooges who'll do that for you, but they want the message of that bloodshed, and the more victims, the better. The more Jewish victims at the time, even better than that. And this is long before the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies had, if you see something, say something. It wasn't the type of thing where people could bomb the subway. I doubt that if you left your bag on a train, it would be there for very long. Somebody would just walk away with it. 9/11 changed our perspective on everything, including that, and including suspicious packages. But this was a different time. They needed a statement that would do for their own needs what they felt couldn't be done in life and couldn't be done in Israel because they wouldn't be really allowed back. The Israelis, if they were apprehended and deported, it could very well be that they would be sent back to the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority, which wasn't what was in their plan. They wanted something else, and they realized that they weren't getting it, and that was what radicalized them. Yeah. I spoke in Jordan to someone from the intelligence service, and who are the people from Jordan or elsewhere in the Middle East that were flocking to ISIS? It wasn't the poor son of the laborer. They were individuals that had university degrees, that had
Wealthy.
done something, wealthy, that had done something with their lives, but couldn't do anything with their lives, if that makes sense. There was no jobs. There were no opportunities. There was really nothing. And um, like the like the ad for the New York lottery, you got to be in it to win it. If you want to be glorious, if you want to have power. Again, in the Middle East, people, the man on the street, in many cases, doesn't have power, doesn't have the opportunity, that American dream, where anybody could go from rags to riches, and that creates something. And if you add that with the manipulation of religion, the economic disparity between rich and poor, the tribal system, where the nepotism, all sorts of ills that we as a nation always try and fix, but in many ways are unfixable. You end up with individuals that are hopeless, and these two happen to be hopeless idiots. They believe that this suicide bombing, this double tap on a subway train, would have brought them prominence, and they were right. Had they succeeded, they could have killed hundreds of people. Um, I mean, look at the chaos, destruction of the 7/7 attacks in the London Underground. How many people were killed? Um, and in the middle of a subway tunnel that is 100 plus years old. It would have been packed with commuters. I mean, the death toll would have been staggering. It would have been really, really horrible. And just it reminded me of something, but it's very, very pertinent. Um, we're talking about 19 after 1995. 1995 is an important year because not only do you have on the fundamentalist Islamic side um, the Day of Terror, the landmarks case, the plan that was supposed to happen. You also have Oklahoma City. And in many cases, law enforcement sort of shifted their gear from overseas terrorism to homegrown terrorism. And there wasn't the focus that needed to be. And the connection wasn't made on multiple levels between what happened overseas and the immigrant population that was here.
So when all of this domestic terrorism starts to happen, you talk about the federal bombing in Oklahoma City, and you see the World Trade Center be bombed, and we see a lot of the things that people up until that time go, that happens over there, not over here. I don't think that a lot of the civilians or people that weren't in law enforcement or the intelligence services or anything like that understood the kind of wind of change that was coming through. Because would you agree that I think that at that point it was decided that this can happen over here or we can cause destruction over there too, so let's take the fight over there and not only destroy maybe our homeland, but take something else with us, because if it happens over there, we're not going to really know about it. The normal person walking down the street is not going to know them. If they come to the United States and do it, their names will be infamous. They'll be known in the news. It'll be a worldwide news blurb. It won't if it happens in the West Bank.
It probably won't if it happens in Topeka or in Des Moines or elsewhere. It happens in New York, where it's the center of the media universe, center of the, going back to the Statue of Liberty, the center of immigration to this country, the center of the melting pot. So New York was ground zero for many, many individuals. It was always a target. It will always remain a target. Because if you want to get, lesser to extent now with everyone has a camera, a studio quality camera on their phone, and they can report live from the scene. But in 1997, 2001, where the media was headquartered mattered. And it mattered in New York.
So are you saying, because I want to understand you correctly, are you saying even today, with everything that's happened in the world since then, since 2001, since 9/11, even in Topeka, even in Des Moines, it's still not as, it doesn't cause a ripple?
It absolutely causes a ripple. But the global events, terrorism is two things. Terrorism is an evolving, living creature. The terrorists try and think of what they can get away with.
Okay.
And law enforcement is always fighting the last attack.
Law enforcement is always playing catch up to it.
Always catch up.
Always.
And that ultimately is the danger and the equalizer in all this is intelligence. Because if you know that something's going to happen, you're not playing catch up. You're not responding. You're reacting. You are deterring. You are preempting. And in today's world, I believe that you can perpetrate an attack anywhere, and it will get media coverage, and it will spread in ways that it couldn't spread in 1997, and it couldn't spread in 2001 on 9/11.
So let me ask you then, since we're talking about that. In this case, we're in 1997. We have an informant come up. And like you said, it was a perfect storm. The wheels turned quickly. Everything got done. And you're exactly right. Overnight, you're fighting an even, people wouldn't realize this, but an even greater bureaucracy at night, because now you're waking people up. Now you're having to get people out of bed. So there's an even greater one. So I agree with you there. But it's interesting that in 1997, this happens on a local level. I'm going to say that it's going to be a huge attack, but it's on a local level. And then you see when we move forward into 2001 and 9/11 on a national level, there has been discussions that there wasn't intelligence sharing between major heads of departments, major organizations. So I don't know if you can tell, but what's the difference that we see this move so quickly, and then we have such a larger scale attack happen where national, could have known, or intelligence could have shared information? What's the difference?
The difference is that before 9/11, we were blind. And we were blind because we didn't connect the dots and we didn't really speak. Terrorism was something that happened overseas. Therefore, the grace of God, go us, go them. It's someone else's problem. We're too big, we're too strong. And I think that when we talk about the road to 9/11, because 9/11 didn't happen in a vacuum, that the success that law enforcement had in defeating the perpetrators of the World Trade Center bombing and foiling the Day of Terror attack, gave individuals here a false sense of grandeur. We're too smart for you. We're too big. You're never going to defeat us. And a year after the incident in Brooklyn, on which my book is covers, there are the embassy bombings in East Africa. And what Al-Qaeda was doing was copying the playbook of Hezbollah. What Hamas was doing in suicide bombings was copying the playbook of Hezbollah. The terrorists at the time, less so today because of the way that cell phones and everything can be intercepted, but the terrorists at the time networked. We didn't. I was doing at the time of the attack in Brooklyn a lot of work with the NYPD's emergency service unit. And there were incidents, barricade individuals who had murdered their parents and had murdered a police officer and were holding the police at bay just north of New York City. And the local police department didn't contact the police department next door that had a peacekeeper armored car that could have rescued an officer who was shot and left to bleed to death in his vehicle, because they chose to contact the NYPD. And it took several hours to get the armored personnel carrier that the NYPD had at the time to the location. Law enforcement didn't speak. Law enforcement, in many cases, is its own bureaucratic worst enemy. And there are numerous reasons, and I think you'd need someone much higher in the food chain than me to kind of address them from, the managerial level. But the good guys didn't network. There were cases where they did. In 1999, Algerian terrorists who kind of were part of the Al-Qaeda fraternity hijacked an Air France plane and wanted to crash it into the Eiffel Tower. And it was refueling in Marseille, and the GIGN, the French Gendarmerie counterterrorist unit, stormed the aircraft. It was a brilliant operation that could have gone wrong in many ways. And the French did send those individuals to Washington to speak and brief. But there were numerous incidents that happened in Europe, that happened in Israel, where the good guys just didn't know how to share. There were bits and pieces, but there was no information network. There was no way to share tradecraft, lessons learned. In Europe, exchanges between law enforcement units and agencies were very, very common. You could drive from one country to the other. In the U.S., departments and department bosses didn't want agencies traveling within the county to a different jurisdiction.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think that is they couldn't share, or didn't know how to share, or wouldn't share?
All of the above.
Okay. So do you think 9/11 changed all that? Or do you think we're still building that camaraderie? We're still building those networks?
I don't know how much. I know that in certain states, agencies shared and they worked together. The only way that you can tell if it's really working is if that's used to prevent an attack, or in the after action report of an attack that's ongoing, or an attack that failed to be noticed, and we're scratching our heads and wondering what went wrong.
You would agree, though, that the attacks that are thwarted or that never happen, a lot of those don't see the light of day for anyone to know about.
No. I think that if we, one day, I think that we'll be unbelievably shocked how many active plots law enforcement and primarily the intelligence community stopped. And I think many of them, it'll come out, were stopped overseas. And I think that the agencies, from the intelligence side and the law enforcement side, the FBI, the Diplomatic Security Service, and the DEA, that were all part of the war on terror overseas, are owed salutes and accolades beyond what any of
Absolutely.
us can provide, because they were really the coal mines and the canaries of being a front line in sometimes very hostile locations. And I don't think that we understand the danger, the sacrifice, and the success that that because of them, many hundreds, if not thousands, were able to live normal lives without knowing that they were in the crosshairs.
So we talked about playing catch up at all times. Is there ever a way that we get in front of the mule of this cart?
That's only through intelligence. It's only through understanding, and I think that recent events have shed a little light on that. I think sometimes when you're so ultra focused on one threat emanating from one location, you lose sight of other threats. So
Can you
it
give an
shouldn't.
example?
Um, I think that right wing extremists operating what happened on January 6th, mass shooting attacks in this country, are examples of the war on terror provided law enforcement with a lot of the tools that it needs to fight. And I think that in some cases, focusing on terror of only the Middle Eastern variety let us kind of be in a position where we have to play catch up on the other
So on
variety,
domestic terrorism.
on domestic terrorism.
Okay.
And I think that terrorism doesn't matter um, to law enforcement, not the intelligence communities, not the people who are trying to get inside their cell phones and inside their social media, but to law enforcement. If the person driving the U-Haul van with explosives speaks Arabic or has a southern drawl, it's how you stop that individual. There are two elements here that are connected but separate. Intelligence is always the key, and part of intelligence, and I think we're going to sadly face a difficult period once the Taliban kind of goes back to being the Taliban that we know and hate. That by us not having boots on the ground, and when I say boots, I don't mean soldiers, I mean intelligence, eyes and ears, that we will be blindsided. And I'll give you an example. In 1994, as part of the Oslo Accords, the Israelis left the major cities in the West Bank. And they, in certain other areas of the West Bank, the Palestinians controlled the civil administration. The Israelis had a small security footprint. But in the cities where a lot of the plots and the plotters lived, the Israelis didn't have the eyes and ears of the intelligence officers doing their business. They had no or little leverage with the locals that they would recruit. The second Intifada begins in 2000, and by the summer of 2001, shortly before 9/11, the catastrophic suicide bombings begin. It culminates in March of 2002 when, during Passover, a suicide bomber enters a hotel and goes into the ballroom where all these families are having their holiday dinner, and he blows themselves up. And Israel goes back into the West Bank. And that was the beginning of the end of the suicide bombings in the Intifada, not in as much that the Israelis killed or captured many of the terrorists, but because they had returned and set up networks that were lost. And they set up the technological elements that allowed them, as one person once told me, to know about plots before they were even hatched.
And so
And
are we talking about like the Shin Bet or what?
the Shin Bet.
Okay. So for people that may not know, can you kind of describe, because if you haven't heard of the Shin Bet, it's to me it's like a CIA hopped up a couple of degrees.
So you can divide the Israeli intelligence community into three. You have the Mossad, that is a foreign espionage and foreign special operations. You have Amman, which is the military intelligence branch, and they also run agents and are concerned with counterterrorism, but also military capabilities of hostile states. And then you have the Shin Bet, which is the acronym of the General Security Service. And the Shin Bet is responsible for counterintelligence and counterterrorism. They also have an element that protects the prime minister. So they have a small detachment that's similar to the Secret Service and the presidential detail. And the Shin Bet hunts spies and hunts terrorism. That's what they do. They have Arabic speakers in their ranks, and because they were inside the West Bank and Gaza for many years, they had networks that were amazing in terms of knowing individuals, knowing the who, what, when, and where. And the intelligence that they would glean from networks that they'd compromised, from cell phones, from all sorts of signal intelligence and electronic intelligence and human intelligence, primarily human intelligence, were instrumental once they were able to kind of let the Intifada peak in bringing it down to the point today where the only real attacks that the Palestinians perpetrate, on the most part, are either lone wolf, individuals who go on ramming attacks or stabbing attacks, or long distance rockets. And the whole notion of a suicide bombing cells and the business and infrastructure that's involved in that, the commanders, the money, the safe houses, the engineers, the transport, all of the documentation that needs to be forged, all that doesn't exist secretly. There are individuals that have to help. You have to get forgers and all sorts of, you have to get security individuals to protect the safe houses. That's not to say that the Shin Bet has been successful 100% of the time. Hamas and the others, and even the fledgling attempts by Al Qaeda and ISIS to attack inside Israel have not been successful. But the Shin Bet has mastered this to a science. And the Shin Bet has a division that goes after Jewish extremists, just like here we would have right-wing extremism. And I think that moving forward, if there's a lesson, is that the ability of terrorists to carry out 9/11 attacks might not exist in that framework.
Can you go into a little more detail? Because I'm kind of following you, but I want to make sure I am.
With immigration being so closely guarded,
okay,
in terms of access, in terms of being able to follow people, in terms of people who are known to the authorities, airport security that didn't exist before 9/11, that's now in place. It's almost impossible to conceive that there would be multiple hijackings that would evade the intelligence services like it did on 9/11.
So let me play devil's advocate with you for a minute. You're exactly right with the way the airport security is set up, with the way we follow people, with the Patriot Act, with all these things that are done. Like you said, I need to go back though to the playing catch up because now we've just rerouted how people come into the country. They might not come in through New York. They might not come in through Canada. They're going to come in through Mexico. We've seen it with the crisis that's going on at the border right now with people that aren't supposed to be coming across. And I'm talking, criminals, terrorists, things have come across the border there. We've just shifted where they're coming in. Do you think, I understand what you're saying, that big of an attack, but do you think it's just kind of evolving into another way to attack?
Sure. And that's what ISIS did so successfully in Europe. The Paris attacks in 2015. I Law enforcement, from what I've seen, doesn't think along the lines of terrorists in terms of reaction, in terms of there's something in Israel. I'll say the Hebrew, and then that every unit that goes out on a mission does, and it's called mikrim v'tguvot, which is happenings and reactions, meaning that the commander will only approve a mission until he knows from his men what are they going to do if X, Y, and Z happens, and what happens if Z happens before X, and then X happens. They need to kind of know everything and predict and how they're going to react.
Contingencies.
And I think contingencies, but they think in very far-reaching, because there, and it's not to take anything away from the United States or how we think here in this country, but they've had to rely on wits because they've had to do it for so long with so few resources. And I think here, the human element of trying to react and think and be prepared sometimes gets overlooked. And it's certainly in law enforcement, planning doesn't get the reward that acting does.
Okay. I can see what you're saying. With everything that happened with these guys, I think the most interesting part of it was when you say that they just wanted to be relevant, to go back to our main story of this conversation, is they kind of ended up not being known. Like we talked about in the very beginning, this is a relatively unknown story about a terrorist attack. And so the complete irony of wanting to be relevant, and then when all this is done, one is put into a supermax prison, and then the other one serves some time, but I mean, really, no one's heard of them.
Well, I don't think anyone cares about them, but what we were talking about earlier of the good guys talking,
Okay.
and why bureaucracy, especially in law enforcement, sometimes gets in the way more than anything else. This was an incident that should be in the curriculum of every police academy in this country.
Absolutely.
This should have been far more of a national incident than it was. But in this case, the police officers involved were very concerned on multiple levels. The FBI was hinting that, and even internal affairs, that it was a bad shooting because a bomb wasn't a gun. And that in shooting someone who flipped a bomb wasn't the same as someone pointing a weapon at you.
I would have to disagree with that, but
I think we all disagree, but this is what the officers faced.
right.
The officers, the morning after they had been debriefed and after they had their PBA, their police benevolence, their union lawyers sit with them, and they went home. They didn't know what they had stumbled upon. Was this the opening salvo of a terrorist war in New York? Would there be repercussions against them? Lo and behold, they wanted to keep their names secret, but lo and behold, the New York City Police Department releases their names and photos to the newspapers. Now they're worried about their families. The mayor at the time, Giuliani, wanted very much to use the officers as a political backdrop. He wanted to have the press conference at City Hall and milk it for all it was worth. The police officers involved wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted anonymity. They feared for their lives and their families.
Rightly so.
And there was a back and forth between City Hall, the police headquarters, One Police Plaza, and the officers and their union delegates, what they would do at this press conference. They were ordered to appear. They didn't want to appear. According to the officers who were there, and they told me, and I put it in the book, the police commissioner at the time, Howard Safer, threatened to disband the emergency service unit if these individuals didn't play along. Now, mind you, this is 4 years before 9/11.
Right.
And 14 members of the emergency service unit perished on that day. These were not men to dangle threats to. These were real heroes.
Absolutely.
These were tactical officers who part of their rescue packet, part of their job description was rescues. They were lifesavers. So there were all sorts of inner workings in the NYPD, and the NYPD can be a political beast if it wants to.
I
Or it
think
did,
that's
especially.
every major metropolitan police department.
So the story was ultimately crushed. Um, the police department didn't want to submit the officers involved to the Top Cops Award. Ultimately, it was, and they received it. But there was an effort to kind of shush it down. And the good guys didn't talk. And I speak about this incident to command level law enforcement. And I've spoken to it at the command level of the MTA police, which is the Metropolitan Transit Authority here in New York. And the two officers that initially came upon the informant were Long Island Railroad cops. That eventually merged into another department, into the MTA. And young officers aren't familiar with this case. I spoke to the Transit Bureau, the NYPD's Transit Bureau, and there are officers who aren't familiar with this case. And I think on a basic patrolman level, reactionary, on a tactical level, and also command level, what went right that evening needs to be studied and it needs to be discussed. And I think that in many ways, sadly, law enforcement is often a stumbling block to itself, and it doesn't get the message out as it should. And this is one instance.
I agree, but I think that there are ways that law enforcement can get that out without compromising who's involved in it. There's all kinds of redaction ways that you can do that. But I believe, like you said, that this political machine is turning so hard that they need those bodies behind them. They don't need the story. They need the bodies behind them because it looks like support for that political cause.
Absolutely. And going back to kind of what we discussed, the political echelon didn't fathom the threat, the potential threat of having networks in this country that could maybe target the police officers. And the political level needs to be educated just as much, if not more, than the law enforcement level about.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Interestingly enough, actually around the time of this raid, I did work in the Los Angeles Police Department with the LAPD SWAT, and they were doing a live fire hostage rescue training downtown. And the people who were playing hostage were judges. And the police department wanted the judges that would decide criminal cases to understand the dangers that they encounter. Some of the hostages were being played by politicians. I think that the educational level must be political because policy and what happens in the streets drives politics, and the politics drives policy. It's a two-way street. And I think that in one of the tragedies of Afghanistan and other things is that history repeats itself. And we might find ourselves one day repeating a jihad in Brooklyn or a mass casualty event on the scale of a 9/11. It'll be different, but it could be similar. And what lessons were learned from those horrible times and by the horrible intent and actions that could be used to be smarter, to be better, and to kind of not put the political end of it in the way of doing the right thing. And I think that law enforcement, and the NYPD in particular, um, is dedicated to making good things happen out of bad. And they have resources now much more than after 9/11. And I think that all the facets all the dots need to be connected in a municipality, in a county, in a state, and federally. And I think that throwing money at a problem isn't the sole solution. There needs to be brain power. There needs to be common sense. There needs to be pragmatism. There needs to be far-reaching vision. And there needs to be, most importantly, competence.
So, to wrap this whole story up, I want to go because you've talked about it a lot about taking the good from it. So, what I want to do is the takeaways from the intelligence level, what was good on the takeaway from the intelligence level, the street patrol level, the command level, and then an overall kind of terrorism level.
The terrorism level was that the threat was completely unknown. And it was just circumstance. The focus wasn't on Park Slope, Brooklyn. It was elsewhere. And these individuals were so under the radar that expecting the intelligence community to know anything about them would have been a reach. On the patrol level, on the law enforcement level as a whole, all the individuals involved acted above and beyond in courage, above and beyond in professionalism, and above and beyond in just being plain human. Being a young police officer, a railroad cop in Brooklyn on the midnight tour is not easy work. It's not fun work. It's not where you go to retire. And they could have just dismissed this individual. But they didn't, and they took him to a precinct, and they made sure that he was seen. The detectives who spoke to him, the Arabic translator, and by all means the chief, the captain, and the tactical team from ESU, they risked everything to try, and they knew ESU, as part of its package, does rescues, and there have been subway derailments, and they were the ones who responded to the first World Trade Center bombing. They knew the devastation that this would cause, and they put themselves in harm's way, risking life and possible and all sorts of ramifications in the legal system that could have gone against them had the information been wrong. Everything worked that should have. I would say that that is a positive takeaway. The political elements that followed is positive in the way that the officers stood their ground. At the press conference that Giuliani wanted, the officers stood with their arms folded and their forearms covering their name tapes, and only the executive officer, Captain Ralph Pasculo, spoke with his name being identified. He fell on the sword for the other guys, um, and and they stood up to the political hubris. They they didn't let it get them down, and but they weren't rewarded in a way that the NYPD usually rewards individuals that are in good on good incidents, on good shoots.
Well, that was so
Um,
that the NYPD could get their pound of flesh from them for the sheer embarrassment of not backing them up.
it was payback.
Yeah.
And usually in a situation like that before 9/11, these police officers would have been given their gold detective shields right away. And it didn't happen. And I think that a lot of the officers, organizations throughout New York City, cultural groups, civic groups gave them medals, they had dinners for them. They did the right thing. But the police department and the city didn't really do the right thing by them. And I think that was a lesson that should never be repeated. There's always the desire by some in politics on both sides of the spectrum to use these men and women as pawns. And they're not pawns. They're a thin blue line that really stand between destruction and people going to bed at night and sleeping soundly. And I think that that needs to be a takeaway that on every level is not forgotten.
I completely agree with you. You don't hear that sentiment a lot anymore. I think you get the exact opposite of that anymore. And I think that I saw someone post that they missed September 12th. And the reason they missed September 12th was because everyone came together. Everybody knew who the heroes were. Everyone knew what our focus was. And I think that, especially after last summer in the law enforcement community, I think a lot of people have lost focus of what law enforcement is here for.
I well, it's 24 years since the Jihad in Brooklyn, and there was a time when you'd have to open the newspaper to look for a story, whereas now you're bombarded with stories.
Right.
And I saw online someone posted the comments that some people make about, especially about law enforcement. And society, in many cases, has been invaded by idiots. Whereas years ago, the ramblings of somebody would be heard at a bar or in a park corner, and then he would be told to, or she would be told to shut up, and that would be it. Now they have platforms, and people that shouldn't be listened to are listened to, and common sense has all but dissipated into the abyss, and I think it's tragic. And I think that type of scenario opens us up for the lessons of a jihad in Brooklyn, of the lessons that law enforcement in Europe learned battling ISIS, lessons that law enforcement in Israel learned battling Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and elsewhere. All those things get lost in the tidal wave of stupidity that we tend to be bombarded with.
Well, speaking from a law enforcement point of view, we can't thank you enough for what you do, your writings about police, everything that you do to put that culture forward. You can't be thanked enough for that. I want
Well,
to get
thank you very
into
much.
your well, and it's truly meant. We appreciate it so much because, like we've both said, there's very few people. Um, I don't know if there's very few people, but there's a lot of silent people right now, and the squeaky wheel is kind of getting the oil right now. Hopefully, that will change at some point. But let's talk about SamuelKatzOnline.com, where people can go and find you, and then tell them, I want to talk about your latest, what you have coming out, what you have in the works, and where people can find your stuff.
My last book, released in the middle of the pandemic, is No Shadows in the Desert. And it's the story of how the Jordanian GID, their intelligence service, and together with the coalition, the American-led coalition and the CIA, hunted down the leaders of ISIS and ultimately led to the military destruction of that organization. And the operation commenced in February of 2015 after a Jordanian F-16 pilot that was captured and shot by ISIS. His plane malfunctioned and he parachuted over the city of Raqqa. How he was captured, and ultimately he was set ablaze, burnt alive in a Hollywood-like film extravaganza that ISIS blasted on social media. And that event, that barbarity, that cruelty of filming someone being burnt alive was a point of no return for King Abdullah, for Jordan, and for the moderate Arab world. And Jordan was one of the first nations to contribute forces into the war against ISIS, one of the leading nations. They also sent forces in Afghanistan as well. But the Jordanian intelligence service became, in many ways, the human intelligence main ally of the CIA. They had assets inside the tribal areas of Iraq and elsewhere. They understood the mentality. They had the native speakers. They had the real deal. And using human intelligence, together with the CIA's massive signal and technological intelligence, they managed to make the individuals at the ISIS ruling council, the military commanders who gave the order to burn this pilot alive, they made sure that one by one they met with very explosive fates. And when the leadership was terminated, the ability of ISIS to maintain its military territory dissolved quite quickly, and it led to the victory, the military victory at least, that we can thank in the war against ISIS.
Well, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to get into that one. Anything else that you want to promote?
Well, thank you. If you visit the website samuelkatzonline.com, you'll see previous books, how to order them. There's also, for law enforcement, if they want to invite me as a speaker, there's a form to fill out. And if people have questions, there's an email form that they can fill out, and I usually respond. I try and do it within 24 hours.
It was so great for you to come on. This book is absolutely fantastic. People not knowing this story and having heard it before, to bring it to the forefront. Everyone needs to check it out. Plus your other books. I mean, you've written so much stuff, hundreds of articles, over 30 books. You're pretty much everywhere. You're on Kindle. You can find your stuff on Amazon. You can order it through your website. I really want people to get out and check this guy out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. And like I said, for everything that you do for law enforcement, for the kind of carrying the torch and letting people know what these guys are really out there doing every day, we can't say thank you enough to people like you. I think
I'm the one who's honored. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's going to be it for the show tonight, guys. If you want more of me, you can get me on Instagram at DTD_podcast. You can find me on Facebook at the DTD podcast, and you can find me on YouTube, all the video versions of these conversations at the DTD podcast. Remember, when you go on there, subscribe, leave a comment, and review us. It helps us grow. Remember, the best stories are true. And if you want to hear them, you come here every week because we give them to you. That's going to be the show. That's Sam. I'm DJ. That's going to be it. We'll catch you the next time. Bye, guys.